We read from Genesis 21. An interesting piece to note is when God first made the promise to Abraham and Sarah that they would have a child, Abraham was 75. Now he's 100 years old. It's a long time to wait. The Lord dealt with Sarah as he'd said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he'd promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time at which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have ever said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Many of you know that when I was a child, I lived in Tanzania. I lived in Dar es Salaam, the capital city, a big, bustling, busy urban place. But for as big as it was, my family was still the only white family in the entire neighborhood. And even in my international school, I was a minority. There were children from India, Japan, China, Germany, Sweden, Norway, England, and many other countries. And even though there may have been other white kids, I was the only American white kid. But it didn't matter. I always felt welcome wherever I went. In Tanzania, they speak Swahili, and there is a word that means welcome, karibu. When people go on trips to Tanzania, they're usually overwhelmed by the hospitality of people who have far less than them. Villages will literally eat less for weeks to save up food so that when these foreigners come to their village, they can have a feast. They don't worry about not having enough. They operate out of a mentality of hospitality, of generosity, of karibu. Now, I've moved many times in my life. We moved to Waukegan, Illinois, and I went to 2 different elementary schools and a junior high there. Then we moved to Anoka, where I spent 2 years at a new junior high, and then I went to a different high school. I graduated from college, and since then I've lived in Oregon, St. Paul, Rochester, and now here. In all places I've lived, and in all of the schools I've gone to, I've received different kinds of welcome. Some were really good welcomes, some were wary welcomes, and some were indifferent. Try to think of a time yourself when you were welcomed warmly, maybe to a church or to a person's house or to a new place, a new neighborhood. Think about when that was and what it was that you knew and felt to understand that you were truly being welcomed. Now think about a time when you were not welcomed well. Maybe you just sort of had this feeling as if you were imposing. Maybe you found yourself defending yourself or your ideals over conversation. Maybe you were just ignored. Maybe it was just little comments and jabs you weren't sure about, but you just didn't feel welcome. We know the difference between feeling welcome and unwelcome, and it never feels good to feel unwelcome. It never feels good for people to assume the worst about you. It never feels good for people to just look at you and instantly judge if you're worthy of their time and resources. In our first story today, Abraham welcomes 3 strangers and gives them wonderful hospitality. In that time, you had to rely on strangers to house you and feed you and keep you safe whenever you traveled. And it was a dangerous time. Because it was a dangerous time, Abraham put himself at risk welcoming these 3 strangers. I don't believe he had any inkling they were angels, at least not in the beginning of their visit. And so for all he knew, they could have robbed him, kidnapped some of his household, or killed him. There is a risk whenever we welcome someone we don't know. But Abraham was an immigrant. He had traveled a lot in his life already, and he had received different kinds of welcome. He knew fear. He knew what it was to be a stranger, but he also understood God. God had offered him a welcome and a generosity, and he was trying to understand how to live that out himself. Abraham chose welcome over fear in this story. I'll cut to the chase. It is very tempting for you and I to live out of fear. In fact, our culture dishes out fear and cultivates it like a business. And actually, fear wins votes. Those that use fear and offer a scapegoat to put our fear on tend to do well. They look like heroes to the majority of us. The problem is when you're afraid, especially afraid of others, you tend to think either or, black or white, us, them, always, never, friend, enemy. There's no room for questions, for wiggle room, for gray. And this is what fear does to our brains. It actually shuts down our ability to think and use logic and pushes us only to fight and flight. This last week when I was at the Eastern North Dakota Pastors Leadership event, that's like the longest phrase ever for where we were at Fair Hills, and we heard a lot about refugees and immigrants. Jessica Thomason from Lutheran Social Services came to talk about the recent explosion of fear in Fargo regarding refugees coming to North Dakota. And despite personal attacks and hate mail and a daily assault she receives on her faith and character, she remained amazingly kind and open and is ready to listen and engage in conversation with anybody and to educate them. Because most of what she hears people say to her isn't actually based in reality. For example, she sat down and talked with the chief of police in Fargo, who said it wasn't true that immigrants were causing more crime. He said that most of the crime, this is the chief of police, still comes from those of us, the Petersons and the Olsons and the Swensons. Unfortunately, when something does happen, when an immigrant may get caught up in something, it always makes the news, doesn't it? Highlighting our fear. A majority of refugees who relocate here find jobs within 3 months. They want to be self-sufficient. In fact, many of them from the countries they come from are leery of handouts. They don't want them. There are enough jobs to go around. There is enough food. And furthermore, 9 out of 10 of the refugees coming to North Dakota are actually reuniting with families that have already been living here for quite a while. One of the fears Jessica Thomason hears about is the fear of Islam, believing it's inherently violent and the Muslims are coming here to take over. And it just doesn't hold water. The refugees continue to speak how appalled they are at the violence done in the name of Islam. And they're running away from violence. They're tired of it. They don't want any more part of it. See, without speaking to people who are different, without forming relationships, it's easy for our imagination to run away, for us to believe rumors, and for us to give into fear. And most of our fears come from the unknown. And in our worry, we stop thinking about the big picture. For example, we forget our own history of our own people's immigration in America. We forget that every single group that came to America had some sort of struggle and was often met by scorn with the existing groups there. We often forget that that first generation struggled to learn English, and that statistically it's taken 30 years for every new group to officially assimilate into the culture. And yet fearful and hate-filled voices demand that any new immigrants who come to our country today have to speak English almost instantly. We're placing demands on refugees and immigrants that are unrealistic, cruel, and unwelcoming. And we also forget that America was founded by people fleeing religious persecution, and so that America, more than anything, is a country where we should accept diversity, including diverse religious views. Now, I want to be clear. What I'm talking about today has nothing to do with partisan politics. I am not advocating who you should vote for or what party has the best answers to this issue. I'm talking about the Bible and theology and what happens when what we say we believe actually becomes practical on a daily basis. Being a faithful Christian doesn't mean trying to uphold Christian privilege or fearfully and attacking others who are different. Being a faithful Christian challenges us to study the stories of the Bible as ways to understand the story we're living in today and to embody God's welcome, especially when it becomes countercultural. For example, when we remember that Abraham and Sarah were immigrants, that Joseph was trafficked into Egypt and his whole family immigrated then to Egypt. And then Moses and all the Israelites were refugees running from violence to a new land. Ruth and Naomi were refugees running from famine. Jesus himself, as a baby, when threatened by King Herod, was taken by his father to Egypt as a refugee. I brought back with me a helpful card about the history of refugee resettlement in North Dakota going back to 1948. I have these all over tables down in the courtyard and down in the dining room fellowship hall, just to give some good information. It's really helpful to see what we have done, even just here in North Dakota, our history of helping and our history of welcoming. I also have on the inside of the bulletin, right after the end of the service, a few helpful pieces if you can read through them, but even better to take the bulletin home with you. 3 different things you can try about learning how to live into this openness, this generosity, this welcome that is very countercultural and against the fear-based speak we often hear in our culture. Abraham welcomed 3 strangers because he remembered what it was like to need help and welcome. And this is the part we can never forget. What did he receive out of that meeting? The renewed promise that he would have a child and blessing. Yes, it is risky to welcome new people into our lives. Yes, there's a chance things aren't going to go perfectly, that things might have to change, that we might have to give something up. But when we check our fears at the door, we do so for Jesus' sake. We are called by God to err on the side of hospitality, of generosity. We are called to listen before we judge, to pray before we act, to open our hearts before we close our doors. Because here's the good news. God has welcomed you and me so generously and so abundantly. We spend our entire lives wrapping our hearts around that. And still God shows up to bless us. Not one time, so that if you miss that opportunity, you're in trouble, but over and over again. And the hard word is that sometimes God doesn't just show up in the sunsets and the lakes, but in the strangers. And not the strangers that look like us either or speak the same language, but sometimes those who really see the world very differently. It is there in that meeting when we confront our fear that we meet God. When we start to live in the generous, open welcome of God, we are blessed. That is a promise. We are changed, but we are made whole. Amen.